Hey, Askapro community. We continue to interview our experts to suggest you a deeper look into their background and for you to adopt the tips they have to share at your company. Today, I invited Alexander, a co-founder at Askapro and a software engineer of 13 years, to talk about iOS development, the relationships between managers and tech teams, and also his journey of launching his own startup. Okay, let's then jump right to the questions. So, please shed some light on your engineering background. Just a few words of your journey into professional.
Okay, of course. As you said, I started about 13 years ago. I started as a full stack developer. The time I started front-end wasn't a thing yet, so we were mostly backend developers with little of JavaScript and HTML. But even then, we were trying to abstract out HTML and JavaScript as much as possible. We only wanted to do .NET, C#, and it was ASP.NET Forms. It was Microsoft's way to let developers, engineers don't use HTML at all because HTML was awful at that time.
Okay.
But gradually things started to change. Microsoft introduced new platform, new architecture, ASP.NET MVC. The main idea behind this was that it was more and more HTML and JavaScript, and the only way to create a perfect user experience was to use all this, and it never worked with ASP.NET Forms properly. And that time, some JavaScript frameworks started to emerge, like Spine and Angular, and we started to learn it a little. But still, most of us we never liked JavaScript. With time, it was clear that to use JavaScript in software development would be inevitable. So we started to separate our teams. We had backend and front-end developers. I guess it was after 7 years as I started my work in my first company, Sravni.ru. And that time I decided, of course, to be backend developer because I had more experience in this area and I thought it would be great, and no JavaScript, of course, which was perfect for me at the time. But I started to see that when it comes to project, business never discuss features or ideas about the product with backend developers. So I thought that I started to feel that I'm missing out. I want to be closer to the product part of the process. So I decided to try myself in front-end development. And the time Facebook showed presented React and Flux, and I loved this immediately. It was a wonderful declarative way to create user interface that was only dependent on state, but still JavaScript was there, and it wasn't my thing. On the other hand, I was that time I was already a huge Apple evangelist, so I decided to try myself in iOS development.
Okay.
It was painful first because it was Objective-C at the time, and it was a very clumsy language when you compare it with C#, for example. But on the other hand, there was a platform that time that was called Xamarin. It was Microsoft attempt to create cross-platform framework for Android, iOS, and Windows, of course, because they wanted more developers to create applications for Windows. And it was written on C#, and you could code on C# in it. So I tried it, and it was my first attempt to try myself in iOS development.
Thank you. I guess you answered like 5 questions forward. And I have almost nothing to ask you anymore. But is it safe to tell that software development is your true passion?
In a way, I think yes. My true passion, I guess, to create. I love the result when you do something that you could use or other people could use, and it's wonderful. And one way to achieve this is software development. Actually, when I was choosing my profession as a school graduate, I never wanted to be software development. I wanted to be in machinery. I wanted to create big machines, maybe even robots. But I decided that I don't have enough how to say it background to be in this field. On the other hand, with software, you could only thing you need to create something is your notebook, which is perfect for many people, and it's quite easy to start actually and try yourself and see if it's your thing or not. So that's I guess the main reason why I decided to become a software engineer, and of course I loved it. So
thank you for sharing. And what was the very first feature you created independently and for commercial usage?
a feature that I created independently as a software engineer. It was in my first company. I remember this. We needed to show our users points on the map with bank branches and ATMs. And now the database, there were a lot of points, locations with ATMs. And when we added all them on Yandex map, that the time we use Yandex for our service, it started to work very slowly because JavaScript was slow and it was all in the browser, and we needed a solution for this. And I decided that we could just unite a few points, a few locations in one, with a number of locations in this area. And when you scale up the map, you see more locations. And that time it was a huge challenge for me because it took not only a lot of C# and backend, but actually JavaScript too. And as I said, I never was good in JavaScript, so but I implemented this feature, and I guess in 2 or 3 years, maybe clusterization. I didn't know at the time that it's how it's called, clusterization, but in Yandex Maps, it was a default feature that every user could use just by some configuration. It was very easy, but that time, Yandex didn't offer this feature, so I like this challenge, and I think it was very important commercially too, because for our business, bank locations on the map was very important.
Like in the time of your first feature, did you have someone to turn to, or you just had to figure it all out by yourself?
At that time, I wouldn't even try to find someone to help me, but it's because my business that time they allowed me to do such experiments. But now, after 13 years in this field, I realized that sometimes even a small advice could be very helpful and could help you to jumpstart quickly, and it's very important for business. So maybe with all my baggage of experience now, I wouldn't try to do it all by myself without even try to Google it or maybe consult with someone.
Yeah, we briefly discussed it previously, like why you turned to iOS development. But could you say, like, uncover it a little bit? What do you find so fascinating about Apple products, and why did you decide to build apps for iPhone?
Yes, of course. With Apple products, actually, I guess the most important thing is how they feel. Because when you take an iPhone in your hand and you can feel it, you want to interact with it. And the wonderful thing is that even if there are some small bugs or some features are not implemented completely as you would expect, but the design, the details, and this feeling of the device, it mitigate all these small bugs, and you almost never feel frustrated. And I guess that's the most important thing for me in Apple products is the attention to details. And another thing I like how Apple approach to creating new standards of something, because Apple is the company that was never afraid to drop some very popular standard and in a way force their users to adapt and to use new protocols, for example, new frameworks, and it's very important for progress, because when other case when some committee is governing and decided how we will use a new protocol, it usually take about 10 years to implement this and make it standards. It's very slowly. Slow, and Apple is the company that helps the standards to move forward to become better.
Okay, thank you. And on the other hand, what do you find most challenging about iOS development, maybe in comparison to Android development? You luckily interact with your colleagues all the time and have a chance to discuss the differences.
Yeah, I think that most challenging thing would be the way how Apple built their frameworks. Because if you want to create something for iPhone, Apple tries to do everything for this. Your application feels like native application, like any other iOS application created by Apple, and for this you need more granular interface to create the application, and it takes much more time. And for example, a few years ago, Android developer never have had to worry about scaling. All devices have a different form factor, and Android operating system would scale the application automatically. Even images, they always use vector images. Apple at that time never allowed us to use vector images for very important reason, because when you use vector images, they should render every time users see it, and it takes processor time, and application could work slowly. And Apple would never allow that, but for Android developers, it was never a problem. Maybe the quality of the application and user experience would be a little worse, but it was never responsibility of developer to add different sizes of the same image for different iPhones resolutions, for example.
And would you say it's quicker innovation versus quality, or Apple can innovate too? And maybe you can make an example.
I mean, it's never good to drop quality for the sake of innovations, and it's never good to innovate for the sake of innovations. Like for example, Samsung does with their folding phones. The user experience is still a most important thing, and that's what Apple provides us with. Innovation should have some goals in sense what we have to achieve, and what the biggest goal is to let our users to use products in most efficient and in the same time how to say it more beautiful way, like you want to use it, and that's what Apple does in sense of innovations.
And probably as a user, you also vote for this kind of way when user experience is more important than innovation, right?
Of course, yes.
Okay, thank you. And did your background in backend engineering help in iOS development? And what would you recommend to junior engineers who are aspiring iOS developers?
I think my backend background helps me in a few ways. First of all, it helps me to communicate with the rest of the team more efficiently because I could understand their problems, and there is always this fight between backend and front-end developers about if this thing should be implemented on backend side or front-end side. And if a person understands the problem of both platforms, backend and front-end, it's much more easier to find a compromise and to fight less about this. And another thing, when I started my iOS development journey, on my first interview, I came to this guy who told me that you backend people, you always use your object-oriented programming all the time, and here in iOS we just put everything in one file, and that's okay for us. So you probably wouldn't make a good match for us. And I still decided that it's a better way to create applications this way because it's still a program. Doesn't matter if it's a backend or front end. Front end could be very complicated, very complex, and the same approaches you could use in backend you could use in iOS too. And now I see more and more that people create different kind of architectures for iOS. Like for example, take Viper. Viper means that you have use at least 5 different kind of entities for your application, like views, presenters, interactors, and so on. And it's very granular, and this what we call OP approach. The experience I got with it, I could use it. I could use it in iOS a lot, and it helps me very much.
Thank you.